it gets pretty deep. And so I'm going to go over patterns of injustice for these four various groups, spending a little bit different amounts of time on each group. But I want to frame Robert Bullard's. He's got these 5 commonalities that occur for people of color within the context of environmental oppression. And so the first is, and here's they enter the host society and economy involuntarily. And in this case, he's talking about colonizers. He might use white people. When we're talking about globalization, we might say a corporate reality enters that community. So the second, so they come and they weren't necessarily invited. And then the second is that their, and so that's different than they, another group, their native culture is destroyed. And so with contact, with globalization, with colonization, all of those impacts, the local peoples or the people who were displaced to come to a place, their culture is actually not eradicated, but affected, often very negatively. Then the third, and he says white-dominated bureaucracies impose restrictions from which whites are exempt. And a number of the speakers have already touched upon structural inequality, institutional racism, structural violence. But looking at that, we've had dual legal institutions imposed by governments that whites in our country have been exempt. We'll get into some of them coming up. And then fourth, the dominant group, and within this context, white people uses institutionalized racism to justify its actions. And finally, a dual or split labor market emerges based on ethnicity and race. And so probably everyone's like, whoa, that's a lot right there. And probably most people already know this, but like whiteness was made up, right? People know that, like there's, it's kind of fictitious, but now it's an institutionalized thing. But in the beginnings of this country, there was no whiteness. And so whiteness was actually created as a system to separate people because in our early history, there was a time period where indigenous people, both free and enslaved Africans, and some other groups, and working class white people were actually getting together in solidarity because they were unhappy with the owning class. And so what got invented? Whiteness, to actually separate people, and a series of laws and practices to separate people. So before that, there was actually not whiteness. You were Italian, you were Puritan, you were whatever your kind of grouping was. Okay, so my objective going forward is to show some of these historical dynamics for these four groups, and really how has this historic institutionalized racism affected this particularly population's right to have healthy, affordable, local, culturally relevant food. And so with this, you're going to have to connect some dots on your own as well. So with the first group, Native Americans, and right now I'm going to get into a lot of just tidbits, so keep breathing. So as we know, issues with Native Americans in this country have a really long history. And as a result of European invasion, there were an estimated 15 million Native Americans. There's 500 different tribes living here, and through contact, their population was reduced as low as 2%. Currently, it has risen to about 13 to 15% of its original, but imagine, 98% of the people that originally lived here, genocide, contact with germs, warfare, all sorts of different things. But that's pretty big. So through invasion and colonization, Native American peoples were subjected to oppressive policies such as taking away their lands, breaking both nomadic and hunter-gatherer agricultural traditions. So these are Native Americans historically are a agricultural community. They're like the original permaculturalists, right? Then forcing them onto reservations, forcing their children into boarding schools where they were abused and acculturated, and banning their spiritual and ceremonial practices. There was a 100-year period in the US where Native American peoples weren't allowed to practice their spiritual traditions. And then today, Native American communities are faced with environmental justice issues such as oil and uranium, mineral, water, and coal mining, depleted and toxic land, high cancer and mortality rates, monocropping, genetic patenting, desecration of ceremonial sites, fighting for their lands, and constant corporate coercion from corporations and the government. So a lot. And so as a result of all of this and more, Native American populations suffer from trauma, low employment, poor schools, disproportionate health issues, and poverty. And so when the colonists first came to this land, there was an actual, there was the doctrine of discovery saying, sanctioning by the Pope to come on over to the Americas and that, to take land. But there was also a concept known as terra nullius, and it pretty much translates into this idea of free, vacant, empty land. Like, no, there were not 15 million people here. It was, pristine forests and open meadows and all ready for the taking. And so this ideology was really presented to allow the taking of land. And there's actually, the philosophy behind it is if a group doesn't work and profit off of their land, they can't claim it as theirs. People would say, these people, they're not working the standard 8 to 10 hour day, and I don't see their buildings, or while this was a very well managed ecosystem. But if you're not doing that and not maximizing your profits, then it's open for taking. And so, Ariel Lucky, social justice activist and performer, has a performance called Free Land, which is pretty provocative, and he talks about his own ancestors getting land through the Homestead Act, and how much land was just given away at really low prices. He calls it, and other people call it, white affirmative action, because all of this land, this beautiful land, was actually given up. The land that we're living on today was part of it, places in Colorado. And so, then reservation communities were established because of this displacement of people from their land and concentrating particular tribes in very much smaller places than their traditional range. And so people know probably a little bit about reservation communities, but they tend to be extremely poor. Many are extremely poor, not all of them. Most of them are food deserts. They're far away from healthy food sources. They got the land that's too hard to farm. There's often a lack of water, and then, interesting enough, a lot of these communities were placed on where there were very valuable mineral resources, such as uranium, oil, other things. So now they're really heavy hit with mining and different things. So the land becomes toxic, the water becomes toxic, or the water disappears through all of the different mining needs. And so They're also cut off from traditional hunting and gathering lands, often ceremonial lands. And then you also have a tradition of urban Indians that aren't as well known about, but they have similar conditions to urban African Americans that we'll talk about next. So Native people did not have social, ecological, and physical health issues that are currently widespread until contact with Europeans. And so now Native American communities are plagued with diabetes, alcoholism, family dysfunction, abuse, suicide. All of these relate with trauma and also separation from healthy land and community in that way. With the reservations, there was a practice of commodity foods where the government, the local authorities would actually bring in food. And it was not healthy food, it was canned and boxed food. And so often it wasn't enough food, so there was a slow starvation, lack of nutrition, and often a lack of nutrition can lead to obesity. Native Americans genetically have something called a thrifty gene, which is because they were hunter-gatherers, they would have to store fat and resources because sometimes they would go a long time without eating or slower times. And so if you suddenly have a kind of fat, wheat diet, you become obese really quick because you store it really quick because your thrifty gene is storing that. And so the traditional practices of gardening, harvesting, fishing, and hunting provided for most Native American communities provided not only nutrition, but a lot of physical exertion. And so the healthy restoration, resilience with Native American communities and food is actually alive and thriving, and is a whole nother talk, but I'm not going to go there. But it's something to read about. Winona LaDuke writes a lot about it, and there's so many people writing about this and speaking, and you can even go to some places. So I'm hitting you with a lot of information, so keep breathing. The next group is African Americans, and again, the majority of African Americans are descended from enslavement, where tens of millions of their ancestors were violently forced to this continent, and almost a large portion died even on the travel here. And the first enslaved Africans came as early as 1619, and enslavement lasted for about 250 years, so it didn't end until 1865. And enslaved Africans were separated by language and culture, so they couldn't necessarily communicate in their traditional language with other enslaved peoples. So it's destroying much of their traditional culture. Families were constantly destroyed through enslavement practices, and most marriages weren't legally recognized. So your family could just be broken up like that. And the legacy of enslavement here has persisted in institutional racism, where many African Americans suffer from trauma, poverty, poor health, unacceptable living and working conditions, higher representation in menial labor, exposure to toxicity and high rates of incarceration. And African Americans suffer from two historic displacements. And this is really interesting. One of my mentors, a man named Carl Anthony, brought this up to me years ago, and it was showing me a map of the coast of West Africa and Central Africa, like the ecozone. I'm not the geographer person in geology, but then you look at the same zones on the southern coast and the areas where enslaved peoples were brought, and they're actually the same color. And so there was a way where you could actually bring your own traditions, and the same food crops would grow in the same places. So initially, even though African peoples were enslaved, they were living nature-based existence as agricultural laborers. And so there was some sort of cohesion to a certain extent in that way. And so, but then there was a second historic displacement, and that happened after Reconstruction. And so there was a period of time where when slavery was banned, there was Emancipation Proclamation, so 1865, and then there was this time period, and that picture had supposed to bring up the 40 acres and a mule. Has anyone heard that term? And so that now there's this new freedom where African families, people would get land, 40 acres, a mule, and have a fresh start. But that's not what happened. And so there was this period of time where actually some people, African Americans, held office, and there were communities created, but then there was a strong backlash. And so what happened was the sharecropping system, where families would often live on the original plantations, working the land, but pretty much as indentured servants. So another form of enslavement, where often by the end of the year they would be in debt to the plantation owner. So no justice in that situation. So as a result of this, there were two great migrations of African American peoples flocking from southern regions to the north, and also cities in the west. And the first one was between 1910 and 1920, and then the second period was during World War II. During the first period, there was a big need for the women. African American women had a lot of, I wouldn't even call it opportunities, but there was a need for domestic workers in the north, and then African American men often followed. And then in the second period, and also with a lot of these 40 acres and a mule farming, the soil was being eradicated, was being no longer farmable, so people couldn't even have their subsistence living, so flocking to the north as well. And so in the second period, during World War II, when there was a vacuum of labor with all the men going abroad, there was a need for more labor. So a lot of African American men and then families came to the north and the west. And so by the end of those two periods, there were actually more African Americans living out of the South than actually in the South, which that's a major migration. And so hopefully you're getting the point, though, that originally African Americans and the descendants of Africans were nature-based indigenous peoples working the land. Because often in food justice, we come in and like, oh, these are urban people, when often it's just a few generations removed from somewhat indigenous earth-based existence. And so there was also, during this time, after both migrations, so the first migration and the second migrations, where there was unemployment, there was the Great Depression, and then there was a period of unemployment after World War II, and the hardest hit were African American communities, but specifically African American men. Let's see. Yeah, so keep reading. I know I'm going through a lot of information. So then, at the similar times, there was something called the Social Security Act, which probably a lot of us are familiar with, and it provided benefits to workers, economic benefits, but 2/3 of black workers were actually excluded from this. And at this similar time, post-World War II, there was something called the GI Bill, which created a whole new housing situation in this country, where pretty much any veteran got these allotment of money and really good, our current kind of interest system rates to go buy housing. And this was mostly suburban housing. But what happened is that even though so many Native American, African American, and other people of color fought in the war, they were banned by these new suburbs. They had policies that they wouldn't let people of color buy places, so they had to stay in, people of color spaces, which became urban situations. And at the same time, there was an institutional thing that came as actually part of the Social Security Act that established redlining. And this is where, how many times? Oh gosh, all right, a little bit, all right, I'm gonna have to go really fast. Redlining, which ended up creating, not letting people of color have loans in their own communities, and pushing the white flight out. And so really saying that if you live in a certain community, your housing value is this low. If you live in another community, your housing value is this high. And so again, creating these economic divisions. And so when white flight happened, with people moving to the suburbs, the whites took the wealth base with them because there was no longer an economic base. And also so many of the jobs moved out of urban areas because we moved from more of a skilled labor to a service industry, and often people of color weren't qualified for these as well. And so the result, and it wasn't until 1968 that the Equal Housing Amendment was passed that took off this government legislated ban on people of color being able to purchase houses, this redlining practices. So in 1968 is when that was lifted and places started to quote unquote integrate. But the result was the creation of poor inner cities. The civil rights initiatives in the 1970s were supposed to alleviate this, but then in the 1980s there was a series of backlash situations where affirmative action was removed, and all sorts of welfare programs removed, and there was further movement of jobs no longer being urban but going outward. And so what resulted was a forced dependency of African Americans on social programs such as welfare. And there was also the introduction of lethal drugs such as crack cocaine, and resulting epidemic disease, violence, and mass incarcerations. And we all know that the US has the highest population of its citizens incarcerated, and African American males make up 36% of the imprisoned. I think it's actually higher than that now. And so most now people know the story. 1960 to present, creation of food insecurity and food desert in inner cities, and white flight, the flight of grocery stores, other industries, and so that's where food deserts happen. Yeah, so, okay. All right, I'm gonna really now not do service to the last two groups. I do want to talk a little bit about Mexican Americans, and both Mexican Americans and Asian Americans have a similar pattern with citizenship being held as a barrier to actually having economic sovereignty, ability to own your own businesses, your own homes, and really get a leg up in the US. Because at times when we've needed cheap labor, such as World War II with Mexican Americans, there was something called the Bracero program, where brought thousands of Mexicans to work agricultural jobs, and then when that ended, violently forcing people to go back and not granting citizenship. So Mexican Americans, of course, in the Southwest, parts of Colorado, much of California, the U.S., through conquest and treaties, many Mexican American peoples were actually living in those areas and forced out. There's a whole history here, and I'm not going to do it justice with my time frame. But the Mexican-American War resulted in the U.S. taking 2/3 of what was back then Mexico. So that's a lot of land, and that land started to displace Mexicans, pushing them back into other areas of Mexico. And a lot actually stayed here, but then again, Mexican Americans were used often for cheap labor, and again, forcing them to leave. That Bracero program that I talked about, so that occurred from 1942 to 1964. And those that were here were paid extremely low wages and lived in very bad conditions. And those that came legally, there was also a whole other population that came illegally as well. And then there's a whole nother wave with free trade and globalization. This was mentioned in the morning, but with the free trade agreements such as NAFTA, changed the conditions in Mexico so drastically, so many people who had agricultural jobs, farm workers, sovereignty, suddenly the price of corn and other commodities was so much cheaper with subsidies in the US that it forced them out of business, or competition was just too great. Got a statistic here, the average Mexican farmer spends 17.8 days of labor to produce 1 ton of corn, while the U.S. grain company spends 1.2 hours. So you can't compete with that. And also they had issues with just so many issues, so people needing to come here. And this is just such a big thing. And so 1994 was a passage of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And since it created so much instability in Mexico and in so many countries in Central and Latin America, the number of people needing to come here for work has doubled. And also with all of these backlash border controls and pulling back citizenships, before it was people might come and then they'd go back, but you can't safely do that. So many people live here undocumented. And then there's just a history of people who are here legally and illegally not being able to get loans, not being able to establish any sort of sovereignty. Yeah, so there's something we want to, let's see. Yeah, so the majority of laborers in agriculture in the U.S. are undocumented Latinos and indigenous immigrants from Mexico and other parts of Latin America. So I will just say a few things, because I don't want to leave out Asian American populations. And as I said before, this isn't technically considered a caste-like immigrant group, but I think it is really important because substantial numbers of Chinese were actually brought to the U.S. During that period of Reconstruction that I talked about to replace African Americans working the land when there were supposedly opportunities for African Americans after slavery was abolished. And so when Reconstruction ended and African Americans were forced back to the land working in those jobs, then Asians became less desirable as field hands. And so again, come, don't come. So there's something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and this is specifically related to Chinese, but it was applied to the majority of Asian groups that tried to come to the U.S. That there was a period from 1882 up until 1965 where Asian immigration was effectively banned. Maybe a handful of groups at certain times to come from certain countries, but in general, it was a time period where we weren't letting Asian peoples into this country. And so if you can see kind of with Mexicans, with Asian American groups, with all of these different groups, if we actually didn't have these bans and policies and institutional racism, we would look a lot different in this room right now, probably. And there was a long tradition of Asian Americans also working in agricultural industries, and a long history of racism against Asian Americans, and all sorts of groups, and over 30 different groups from Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Laotian, Cambodian, Filipina, and other groups as well. And of course we know about in World War II, Japanese Americans and concentration camps. And even when those groups were in concentration camps, they were being forced to work the land. So their labor has traditionally been another cheap, free commodity to be exploited by farm workers, and very similar to the patterns for Mexican Americans. So yeah, and I'm sorry this is just so fast, and keep breathing, a lot of information. I'm seeing a lot of like, oh my gosh. And you know, my point isn't for people to like walk out of here feeling all shame. Oh, my point is that we need to know these stories. Because if people are doing food justice work or social justice work or environmental work or whatever you're doing, if we actually don't know these stories and how structural inequity has been created, we're coming in with really, really specific assumptions about groups. And then if we're looking at the bigger picture, and I told you that I teach at Naropa, and if we're talking about beloved community and kind of the bigger connections we all have, I firmly, and as do many people, believe that the people at the bottom aren't the people that are oppressed. They're oppressed, and so are the people at the top, and so are the people in the middle. And so this is all collectively part of us. And really, I was reading something last night by John Powell. I don't know if anyone, he's just wonderful. But it said, feeding the poor is not enough. We must also open up to them. And it's not necessarily the poor, because a lot of people of color and different groups that live in food deserts aren't even poor. So looking at spaces that we actually create. And so, yeah, I think that is all I have. I just want you to take away, though, remembering that it's always, racism is always connected to the acquisition of natural resources, that it's not an arbitrary system. Do we have a couple of minutes for questions?
Yeah, you can take a few.
Okay, good.
Sure.
Okay. That was a long pitch to begin.
Yeah, it was.
Okay. Any questions or comments or anything? None? Are people feeling, oh, there's one back there. Hi.
Hi, my name is Sarah.
Hi.
I guess I'm wondering, what are some of the ways, you just talked about food deserts, and this is like a modern problem that we have today. What are some of the ways that you've seen that being successfully combated? Like urban farming, for example. I guess, what are some of the ways in which you've seen that being fought?
Yeah. And you know, I don't feel that, I mean, there's so many different things with all of these different groups that I've talked about. You know, with Native Americans, there's a whole movement to sovereignty and food justice and resilience and bringing native foods back into communities. You know, we know the food justice movement, there's so much around localization and having access to food, growing food in urban communities. And I think so many of you in this room know more about that than I do. I think the point, though, is that it's important to do that food justice work, But if we're only helping in that way and not changing the larger functioning of our society and even our worldviews around race and economics and the earth, we're again kind of creating these systems in equity. There's something called just sustainability that Julian Eichmann talks about, where there's this whole sustainability movement burgeoning and everyone's becoming green, but communities of color and all those marginalized communities that I mentioned at the beginning are constantly putting out fires. So they're not necessarily reaping the benefits. And we were talking earlier, even the green jobs movement and the food justice movement, in some ways it's like, now we have menial green jobs for you. So it's not changing who's who and where's what, we're just making it green. And so that's not okay. So you need to solve that. No, but you know what I mean? That's a collective change in so many different areas. Okay.
All right, session will resume normal. So read your program.